I used to believe certainty was a kind of armor. If you wore it long enough, nothing sharp could reach you. I had built my life on that belief, on clean lines and clear labels, and everyone around me seemed to agree it fit. I was engaged to Madeline Brooks, planning a spring wedding, joking with my best friend Ryan Coleman about seating charts and open bars. When people asked who I was, the answer came easily. I didn't hesitate. I didn't doubt. Then Lucas Reed entered the picture, and certainty began to feel like something thinner than I remembered. Lucas joined our team in early autumn, when the city's edges softened and the air carried a restless energy. He wasn't loud or showy. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, he chose words as if they mattered. We worked late the first week he arrived, a deadline pressing us together in a quiet office while the building emptied around us. I noticed the way he paused before answering questions, how his eyes tracked the room as if reading between the walls. It wasn't attraction, not then. It was recognition, the strange pull of someone who seemed to understand without being told. Madeline and I had our rhythms by that point. We moved through weekends efficiently, splitting errands, sharing meals, rehearsing a future that looked good from the outside. She loved me in a steady, practical way, and I loved her back with gratitude and intention. Still, I caught myself saving stories from my day for later, as if waiting for the right audience. When Lucas asked how my weekend went, I told him the truth. When Madeline asked, I gave her the summary that it unsettled me. That difference point one evening, as we packed up after another long day, Lucas mentioned his boyfriend in passing, no drama, no apology, just a fact woven into a sentence. I nodded, said something neutral, and felt a small, inexplicable shift inside my chest. It wasn't disapproval. It was awareness, like a door creaking open in a house I thought I knew by heart. I told myself it meant nothing. People said things all the time that didn't change you. After that, we talked more. Not about work, not always. About books and music and the kind of lives people imagine when no one is watching. Lucas had a way of asking questions that felt gentle but exacting. He didn't pry, he waited. When I spoke, he didn't rush to respond. The space he gave made my words feel heavier, more honest. I began to look forward to those conversations in a way that felt private, even when they happened in plain sight. Ryan noticed before I did. He teased me about my new shadow, joked that I'd found a replacement best friend. I laughed along and dismissed it, but the comment lingered. At home, Madeline asked why I was checking my phone so often. I told her it was work. It wasn't a lie so much as an incomplete truth. The first time I realized I was hiding something, it scared me. I had always thought infidelity announced itself with grand gestures and obvious choices. This was quieter. It was choosing a longer route home so I could finish a conversation. It was deleting messages not because they were inappropriate, but because they felt too intimate to explain. I told myself I was protecting my relationship, that boundaries were flexible as long as no one crossed them. Lucas never crossed them. If anything, he respected them more than I did. When I mentioned my engagement, his expression softened, and he congratulated me without hesitation. He asked about Madeline with genuine curiosity, and I found myself describing her carefully, as if precision could preserve something fragile. The pressure built anyway. It lived in the pauses, in the moments when our eyes met and held a second too long before we both looked away. I began to notice the way he listened to me breathe before I spoke, the way my own voice changed when I said his name. These were small things, easy to dismiss, but they accumulated like interest. One Friday, a sudden system failure forced us to stay late while the rest of the team scattered into the weekend. The city outside the windows darkened, lights blinking on in distant buildings. We ordered takeout and worked side by side in a companionable silence that felt earned. At some point, Lucas leaned back and asked if I was happy. That it was a simple question, and it landed harder than it should have. I answered quickly, listing reasons instead of feelings. He nodded, accepting the answer without comment, and something in me relaxed and tightened all at once. I realized I wanted him to ask again. When we finally shut down our computers, the hour was late and the rain had started, a steady drumming that made leaving feel abrupt. Lucas mentioned his apartment was closer than mine, offered his couch if I didn't want to drive through it. The offer was casual, considerate. I hesitated, thinking of Madeline asleep at home, of the life waiting for me if I said no. That I said yes anyway, telling myself it was practical, that there was nothing dangerous about shelter and conversation. As we stepped into the rain, the city blurred around us, and for the first time since I could remember, the future I'd planned felt less certain than the night unfolding in front of me. Lucas's apartment was spare but intentional, the kind of place where every object seemed chosen rather than accumulated. The rain followed us inside in the form of damp jackets and quiet laughter as we shook off the cold. I stood awkwardly near the door while Lucas moved with practiced ease, setting our coats aside, offering water, then tea. Nothing about his manner suggested expectation. That, more than anything, made my chest tighten. That we settled on opposite ends of the couch, a careful distance that felt louder than closeness. The city murmured outside, softened by rain, and for a while we talked about nothing at all, work frustrations, a movie Lucas had half-watched the night before. I told myself this was normal, that two adults could share space without meaning leaking into it. Still, I was acutely aware of the quiet underneath our words, a current waiting to be acknowledged. Lucas eventually broke it, not with a confession but with honesty. He spoke about his last relationship, how it had ended not with betrayal but with exhaustion, the slow erosion of being someone's secret. He didn't look at me when he said it. He stared at his hands, fingers interlaced, as if the memory required physical restraint. I listened, offering sympathy, and felt a sharp, unearned guilt lodge itself in my throat. That I wanted to tell him I understood without explaining why. Instead, I said nothing, and the silence stretched until it felt like a question directed at me. "You don't have to fix it," Lucas said gently, glancing up. "I'm just talking." I nodded, grateful for the permission and ashamed of needing it. I realized then how often I filled space with certainty, how rarely I let myself sit in ambiguity. With Lucas, ambiguity felt unavoidable. It asked me to be present rather than prepared. That we shifted closer without acknowledging the movement, our shoulders now within reach. I noticed the steady rhythm of his breathing, the faint citrus scent of his soap. These details felt intrusive, like knowledge I hadn't earned, yet I held on to them. When Lucas asked if I wanted more tea, I declined, afraid movement would break whatever fragile equilibrium we had found. The conversation turned inward. He asked what it was like to plan a future so clearly defined, and I found myself speaking candidly about Madeline, about the comfort of shared plans and the fear of disappointing someone who trusted me. I didn't mention the parts of myself that felt restless, but they hovered close to the surface, begging to be named. Lucas listened the way he always did, with attention that made my words feel consequential. At some point, he admitted he had been careful around me. He said it plainly, without accusation. "You're engaged," he reminded me, as if reminding himself. "I don't want to be a complication." The word lingered between us. I thought of how complicated I already felt, how my inner life had become a series of careful edits. I wanted to tell him he wasn't the problem. I wanted to tell him the truth, whatever that was. Instead, I said I appreciated his honesty, and meant it more than I could explain. The rain intensified, a sudden downpour that rattled the windows and filled the room with sound. Lucas laughed softly, remarking on the timing, and the tension eased just enough for me to breathe. He stood to check the weather, and when he turned back, we were suddenly facing each other, closer than before. There was no dramatic moment, no music cue or declaration. Just two people aware of the space closing between them. That I don't remember deciding to reach out. I remember the warmth of his hand when mine found it, the way his fingers stilled rather than pulled away. The contact was brief, almost tentative, but it carried the weight of choice. We both looked down at our joined hands, then up at each other, surprise and understanding flickering across his face. "This isn't a good idea," I said, and meant that it was already too late to matter. Lucas didn't move closer. He didn't argue. He simply met my gaze, his expression open and steady. "Then tell me to stop," he said quietly. That I couldn't. The realization settled with a strange calm. I wasn't being swept away by impulse, I was standing still, seeing clearly, and choosing not to retreat. The fear that rose in me was familiar, but beneath it was something steadier, something that felt like truth that I withdrew my hand, the loss immediate and sharp, and stood abruptly. I began to pace, words tumbling out about Madeline, about labels and expectations, about how this wasn't who I was supposed to be. Lucas listened without interrupting, his silence an anchor rather than a challenge. When I finally ran out of words, he spoke only once. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he said. "But don't pretend this didn't happen." I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. The night had shifted, and pretending felt impossible. We arranged the couch for sleeping with careful efficiency, a choreography of restraint. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, every sense alert, I knew sleep would be elusive. The distance between us felt deliberate now, a line drawn in chalk rather than stone. That I and the quiet before dawn, I understood that whatever I did next would carry consequences I couldn't fully predict. The certainty I had worn so easily was gone, replaced by a question I could no longer ignore. And as the rain finally subsided outside, leaving the city washed and waiting, I knew that crossing the line had been less about touch than about acknowledgement, and there was no unknowing it now. Morning arrived without ceremony. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets rinsed and reflective, and the quiet in Lucas's apartment felt deliberate, as if it had been negotiated overnight. I woke before him, or perhaps he had never slept at all. I lay still on the couch, cataloguing the weight of what I had acknowledged and the absence of what I had not done. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like standing on a threshold with no map. Lucas stirred eventually and offered a careful greeting, his voice neutral, respectful. We moved through the small rituals of departure, coffee poured, keys located, without revisiting the night. When I left, he hugged me briefly, a gesture that was neither intimate nor distant, and said he hoped I'd get home safe. I promised I would. The promise felt symbolic, and insufficient. Madeline noticed the difference immediately. She always did. I came home quieter, my answers trimmed of warmth. She asked about the storm, about work, about the weekend ahead, and I answered honestly where I could and vaguely where I couldn't. The space between us expanded, not from anger but from omission. I began to realize how much of our life together depended on the assumption that I was whole and unconflicted. Over the following days, Lucas pulled back. Our conversations returned to work, efficient and public. He didn't ignore me, but he no longer offered the attentive silences that had drawn me in. I felt the loss acutely, more than I expected, and that frightened me. I had told myself the night was an anomaly, a moment of confusion, but confusion didn't linger like this. It didn't rearrange priorities or make absence feel like deprivation. Ryan asked if everything was okay, his tone casual but his eyes searching. I deflected with humor, then regretted it. The truth felt heavier with every person who didn't know it. I began to understand Lucas's earlier words about exhaustion, about the cost of being hidden. I was hiding from everyone, including myself, and it was wearing me thin. The confrontation with Madeline wasn't dramatic. It was quieter, which made it harder to endure. She asked why I seemed elsewhere even when I was sitting beside her. She asked if there was someone else, and the question landed between us with devastating clarity. I could have denied it in a technical sense. I could have argued semantics. Instead, I told her I had crossed a line emotionally, that I had let myself care in a way that threatened what we had built. Madeline listened, her composure steady until it wasn't. She didn't ask for names or details. She asked why. I told her the truth as best I could, without excuses or self-pity. I told her I didn't know who I was anymore, and that I was sorry for discovering it at her expense. The apology felt inadequate, but it was the only honest thing I had left to offer. The engagement ended not with a decision but with an understanding. We both recognized that continuing would require a denial neither of us deserved. Packing up my things felt surreal, a dismantling of a future that had once felt inevitable. I carried the guilt with me, aware that self-discovery did not absolve harm. Lucas and I didn't speak for weeks after that. The distance was necessary, a pause that allowed consequences to settle. When we finally met again, it was by chance, in a coffee shop we had both frequented long before any of this. He looked the same and different, familiar and newly guarded. We talked cautiously, acknowledging the damage without assigning blame. He told me he wouldn't be a secret, not again. I told him I understood, and meant that too. Time did what time does. It dulled the sharpest edges without erasing the shape of what had happened. I began to live more deliberately, questioning assumptions I had once accepted without thought. I learned that identity wasn't something you declared once and defended forever. It was something you discovered through attention and honesty, often at a cost. When Lucas and I chose to try again, it was without illusion. There were no grand promises, only an agreement to be visible and accountable. We moved slowly, aware that trust rebuilt itself in increments. Some nights, the weight of the past pressed close, reminding me of what I had lost and whom I had hurt. Other nights, the quiet felt earned. That I don't frame that night as a turning point because it didn't transform me overnight. It revealed me, and revelation is only the beginning. The line I crossed wasn't about orientation or labels. It was about truth. And once I saw it clearly, there was no returning to the certainty I had worn like armor. There was only the ongoing work of becoming honest, one choice at a time, and the knowledge that some nights change everything, not by what happens, but by what can no longer be denied.